What happens when a global superstar reaches their breaking point under years of public scrutiny? What happens when a casual conversation between friends takes an unexpected turn? The story that is about to unfold is filled with suspense and shock, and a moment that had the whole studio hold its breath. From the ordinary turned extraordinary, this segment that started as an everyday appearance turned into one television show that has everyone talking. And the biggest shock was yet to come. The agenda for the appearance was nothing out of the ordinary. Jennifer Lopez would stop by to chat about her upcoming film and newest entrepreneurial venture, and of course to engage with the viewers at home. The show anticipated another high-profile celebrity interview, with nothing more out of the ordinary expected than simple interview questions, a few funny anecdotes, and light-hearted banter before proceeding with the show. As soon as Jennifer arrived in the studio, it seemed there was an immediate sense that something was different. There was an eerie tenseness in the air that made every guest and host in the studio look around with an unspoken confusion. Jennifer Lopez was greeted by a standing ovation upon her arrival. After the applause died down, her co-hosts welcomed her to the show with their warm and inviting smiles, and she settled into her seat looking more radiant than ever under the studio lights. Although all looked in place as far as it concerned the show, there was one host who didn't look so much. Unlike all the other hosts who appeared more relaxed and amused, Behar's demeanor was far from comfortable. Her eyes were averted, her posture was unusually rigid, and she seemed to be mulling something over in her mind, and anyone would know this to be true the second that their eyes adjusted to the room. The first 5 minutes of the interview went exactly as predicted. Jennifer discussed her latest projects, business endeavors, and other bits and pieces of her life with the most charismatic ease, as the rest of the host enthusiastically listened. Everything seemed to go just as planned, until just when the conversation began to flow, the tone switched without any sort of anticipation. With the show still in the middle of a segment regarding Lopez's most recent work, Joy leaned into the microphone and introduced a topic that neither of the other hosts, Jennifer included, were expecting. Several of the hosts exchanged glances, knowing that they were about to step into uncharted waters, while Lopez maintained a confident smile, but seemed to possess a whole new level of precaution, which was something new to her. The next few moments were completely unexpected. Joy began to speak, and it was easy to hear that her question was laced with something else in addition to friendly curiosity. In a matter of seconds, the interview transitioned into one that was laced with undeniable tension. The studio went silent, and each one of the hosts looked at Joy and then at Jennifer, trying to predict what exactly was about to happen. The next statement of the interview seemed to be the turning point in the entire conversation. Would the host allow the interview to return to normal, or would they dive further in? Jennifer didn't blink at first. Her face remained passive, unreadable, a skill she had perfected in years of navigating interviews, headlines, and the unforgiving glare of public life. If you looked very closely, though, you could see the spark in her eyes shift ever so subtly. Irritation flickered, then vanished as quickly as it had appeared. She took a slow breath and chose her words carefully. "I'm sorry, Joy," she said evenly, "but I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. Are you suggesting that I haven't earned the success that I've had?" The question hung in the air, and suddenly it felt like everyone in the studio was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Instead of backing down, Joy seemed to lean into the exchange even more. In fact, she looked as though she was positively relishing it. "Well, let's be honest," she said, a Cheshire cat smile playing on her lips. "You've had successful songs, absolutely. But let's face it, the critics haven't always agreed about your vocal talent. You're not exactly Whitney Houston or Mariah Carey, for example, and yet you've had an astronomical career. I'm just genuinely curious as to how that's worked." The jab landed. Most people in the room had no idea that this was no longer an interview but an all-out war. Suddenly, the mood in the room completely shifted. The other hosts looked mortified, desperate for a way to regain control, but before Whoopi could change the subject, Joy pressed on. "And your acting career? Again, lots of roles, many of them commercially successful, but have you ever really been viewed as a serious actress by serious film critics? A lot of people feel they've only ever seen Jennifer Lopez play Jennifer Lopez. Don't you think audiences deserve better?" The question hung heavy in the air, and every eye in the room was on Jennifer Lopez. Her reaction was subtle but undeniable. The muscles in her jaw tightened just fractionally. Her hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, gripped the edge as if to steady herself. The smile remained fixed on her lips, but the ease was gone. This wasn't the relaxed smile of a celebrity hawking her latest product. This was the smile of someone calculating her next move very carefully. When she spoke, her voice was still smooth, but there was an edge to it that was unmistakable. "Joy," she began, "I must say this is very different from the interview I anticipated today. But since we're going to talk about my career, let's discuss it frankly. As Jennifer shifted in her seat and turned her full attention toward Joy, something in the energy of the interview shifted again. She was no longer on the defensive, she was taking control. You mentioned my vocal range and I agree. I'm not Whitney Houston, I never would claim to be. Whitney was phenomenal, but I am someone who has worked her entire life to achieve what she has, and I've done so by not compromising and by staying true to myself. I have sold millions of records all over the world, I've had international chart success, and I achieved that by being me, not by trying to be someone else. Joy started to interrupt, but Jennifer kept going, her confidence growing with each word. As for my acting career, I'm shocked and I'm appalled that you're willing to dismiss my work and all my contributions so easily. I've won critical acclaim, I've worked with the best in the business, I've been a part of stories that have moved and entertained audiences around the world. If that's not a serious endeavor, then I don't know what is. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone was afraid to interrupt, everyone wanted to see how this all played out. By this point, you could feel the tension in the room building up, becoming almost too thick to cut. The other hosts were sharing nervous glances with one another, trying to find a way out, but there was no going back. These two women were now on a collision course, engaged in a battle of wills, confidence, and reputations. The confrontation was just beginning, and it showed no signs of slowing down. The stakes were higher than ever before. Sensing that her last comment hadn't gone over the way she'd hoped, Joy seemed intent on digging the hole even deeper. Instead of retreating from the fray, she leaned in with an even more provocative question. But Jennifer, she posed in that disarmingly friendly way that belied a sharp undercurrent. Don't you think there's something to be said for staying in your lane? You've been a singer, a performer, an actress, and a businesswoman. At some point, are you just doing too much? It was the perfect type of question, one that could feign innocence while carrying an obvious biting accusation, and it was in this moment that the entire dynamic of the studio shifted. Until this point, Jennifer had maintained a remarkable composure. But then something broke. The careful diplomatic veneer that had defined all her previous responses began to crack, revealing an underlying intensity no one had previously suspected. She repeated Joy's question slowly, as if testing its weight. Stay in my lane? Her voice dropped, calm but undeniably more forceful than it had been. Then, cocking her head ever so slightly, she asked a question that immediately froze everyone in the studio. Joy, allow me to ask you a question. What exactly is your lane? An absolute silence fell over the room. The question wasn't shouted, but its impact was enormous. For the first time, a hint of surprise flickered across Joy's face. The supreme confidence with which she'd managed the conversation for so long wavered for just a moment. It was clear she hadn't anticipated the tables turning on her so decisively. Shaking it off, she immediately moved forward. My lane? She answered, the words coming with a practice speed. I'm a comedian. I'm a television host. I've been in the industry for decades. I know exactly what my lane is. Even as she answered, the tension in the studio continued to escalate. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully, her gaze never leaving Joy's. A comedian? She said, her voice even. A long, tense silence followed, broken only by Jennifer's follow-up that sent a ripple of unease through the room. When was the last time you actually performed stand-up? When was the last time you stood on a stage and looked out at a crowd of people who weren't already on your side? It was a question that landed like a lightning strike. Around the table, the faces of the other guests grew taut. Nobody seemed to have prepared for where this conversation was heading. The audience, too, was rapt, every eye on the two women. Joy's face tightened, a trace of annoyance starting to color her voice. I don't need to justify my career choices to you, she snapped back, though the veneer of polite curiosity was gone. I've been working in television longer than you've been a recognizable name. I've earned my place here through decades of commitment and hard work. But before Joy could build any momentum, Jennifer cut in with a pointed rejoinder. Hard work? Jennifer repeated, her voice now laced with an undeniable edge. If we're going to discuss hard work, let's talk about what that really means. Leaning forward slightly, she captured the attention of everyone in the room. While others sat back and criticized the effort being put in, I spent hours honing my skills. I trained, I rehearsed, I studied, and I worked tirelessly to improve. Physically and mentally, I pushed myself because I knew that talent alone wasn't sufficient. I knew instinctively that if I wanted anything in life, I had to earn it. Her words tumbled out now, fueled by the intensity of years of professional struggle. I performed for audiences that didn't make excuses. If you were unprepared, they told you in no uncertain terms. I took chances. I failed, but I always got up and kept going. That's what genuine growth looks like. The conviction in her voice was palpable. This wasn't merely a response to a single jab, but a release of years of pent-up frustration. She then leaned in even further, completely commanding the floor. If we are going to speak in terms of lanes, then I never once accepted the limitations that others tried to impose on me. Every barrier I encountered, I viewed as a challenge. I used other people's doubts as fuel. When people told me that someone from the Bronx, could never reach the highest levels in the entertainment industry, I continued to strive. When they doubted my ability to succeed in film, I kept pushing. When they questioned whether I was cut out for business, I continued to build. I refused to let anyone else determine my potential. A stunned silence filled the studio, the hosts' faces as transfixed as those of the audience. Joy, however, seemed determined to get the last word. Seizing what she felt was an opportunity, she interjected. But surely there's something to be said for mastering one thing, rather than dividing your focus among so many different avenues. It was a last-ditch effort to criticize Jennifer's career trajectory, but Jennifer's response was not at all what anyone expected. Jennifer let out a short, sharp laugh. It was humorless, sharp, and carried the distinct tone of hearing a critique one had already solved years ago. She shook her head, and looking back at Joy, it was clear the conversation was about to take a truly unexpected turn. "There's something to be said for focusing on just one thing?" She repeated, a knowing look in her eyes that promised to make the entire room hold its breath for whatever came next. There was no chance of the heat of this debate dwindling down. Jennifer's eyes were glued on her interlocutor as she responded to the issue of specialization. "So this is what you consider success?" she asked, her voice so quiet it felt as though it filled the room and shrunk it even smaller. "Doing the same thing day after day without moving from the spot where you built the wall that defines the boundaries of your world?" This had gone far beyond any normal interview, and everyone was aware of this, their eyes flicking between the two. It was at this stage that Whoopi tried to diffuse the escalating tension by asking, should we try and take the conversation elsewhere perhaps? But there was no containing the momentum this argument had generated. It seemed as though both parties were unwilling to let go of the issue, with the air around them continually constricting tighter and tighter. Joy immediately came back and defended her actions by saying that asking difficult questions was her job. An interview wasn't meant to be a polite press call. According to her, it was part of the responsibility of being a guest to be questioned by an interviewee. It was a way of regaining control of the flow of conversation. However, her comment did something else entirely. It was the spark to an entirely new range of debate. Jennifer smiled for the first time since the clash began, and it wasn't a friendly, charming smile. It was the grin of a competitor who knew they had found a chink in their opponent's armor. It's one thing to ask tough questions, and another to sit back and judge what another person does. She said, her every word precisely chosen. The audience remained absolutely still, aware that the language they were being fed was sending the conversation into uncharted waters. The interview immediately shifted gears from career to lifestyle to philosophies. Jennifer said creating a film, writing a song, founding a company, composing music requires someone to face and deal with the judgment of those looking to have your work picked to pieces, and often to face rejection. It required risk, vulnerability, placing yourself on the line. In Jennifer's opinion, the ability to accept that you would more than likely fail was what differentiated a commentator from a creator. The table became tight around them, and by this point was suffocating. Joy attempted to reclaim her argument of needing to commentate and dissect what is being done in the public sphere, but the assurance that was inherent in her words earlier seemed to waver. The dialogue was no longer about an individual's particular achievement or career, it was about contribution, and the justification of commentary about who defined what. Jennifer continued with what still appeared to be a relatively calm voice that hid so much fire underneath. It was about observation from the outside compared to being in the middle of it all. It was about building a career brick by brick, day after day, when others were telling you that you were never going to make it. The real power of her speech was in her absolute conviction. It seemed as though so many years of frustration had finally found their voice. The studio was strangely quiet, the presenters were immobile, and every audience member was unnaturally still. Even the camera crew seemed entranced, and everyone seemed to know that something more, something entirely unprecedented had just happened. As the argument raged on, the emotional display was palpable. Frustration and determination mingled with the pride and sheer incredulity. Neither woman was willing to give ground, with every statement intensifying the already burning pressure. Then came another charge, another attack, another moment that tightened the vice. Joy exploded and loudly accused Jennifer of getting far too personal for a professional interview, as she stated in clear terms that Jennifer was, after all, a guest on her show. The room went still once more, and then Jennifer's reaction. It was a suppressed giggle, unable to be contained any longer. It was a laugh born not of joy, but of shock and utter disbelief. She shook her head slowly, looking at her interviewer directly across the table. She spoke just one word: professional. Her voice conveyed every single emotion, and the fact that this interview had nowhere to go but towards the very explosive end of this argument. Slowly shaking her head and looking so disbelieving that it was almost funny, she turned back to the hosts and said, "You were the one who opened this door, and you question my talent, my career, and whether or not I deserve any of what I've gotten, and if that's being professional, I'm not sure what words work for you." The air in the studio seemed to crackle once more. With a change in posture, she sat up just that little bit straighter, and somehow managing to command the entire room without raising her voice or moving at all, leaned slightly forward. "You know the difference between you and I? People comment on my work, and it's not really directed at me as much as it's directed at something that I have created. A performance, a project, a business, something that is out there because I was brave enough to make it so and send it out into the universe, and if they're going to talk, then they are going to talk about a tangible thing." As if surprised, the hosts exchanged quick glances as the tension mounted again. One attempted to redirect the topic to future projects, clearly intending to move things back into less volatile territory. But by that time, it was no longer possible. Both parties had become so invested in the debate and so consumed by it that no one could turn it back now. They all knew it. To defend her track record, the host brought up a few decades of pleasing audiences. "Please," she immediately cut in. "Please entertain people. You call it entertain. That's an interesting concept. Entertainment in my mind is meant to uplift people, to transport them somewhere else, to offer people something real and something meaningful that they can relate to, so that long after the lights have gone out, they can feel inspired and they can recall that feeling of being entertained. That's what my intention has always been." Her voice rose with each sentence, gaining strength until you couldn't hear any doubt in her voice whatsoever. The studio was becoming eerily silent and still around her. No one moved, no one spoke. They were all captivated, sensing that this had already transcended being just a normal interview. Each comment was weightier than the previous, and every single sentence escalated the emotion between the two parties. Suddenly, another remark about the personal was made, and something drastically shifted. The calm composure had now turned into a steeliness that wasn't going to budge. Standing still, she was perfectly composed, devoid of any theatrics. Speaking softly, almost chillingly, her words echoed easily throughout the studio, and all of them knew that whatever was said next would truly be the ending of this argument. Her eyes stayed locked on hers across the table as she spoke, her voice unnaturally calm, far more chilling than it was angry. "You just crossed a line," she said barely above a whisper, and the room seemed to contract around her voice. She leaned forward, both hands resting flat on the table, her gaze unwavering. "You want to talk about real? Let's talk about real. Real is growing up with nothing and not letting that define you. Real is years of sacrifice, of rejection, of setbacks, of nothing but sheer work. Real is fighting for every opportunity with all you've got when nobody thinks you stand a chance." Each statement carried more weight than the last. The host began to interject, sensing the show careening into unfamiliar territory. But she carried on, never missing a beat. "No," she responded firmly. "Let's just acknowledge what just happened here." It wasn't the anger in her voice that was remarkable, it was the certainty of it. The conviction that only came from years of being underestimated and proving people wrong. Around the table, no one dared move or interject. Even the audience seemed transfixed, completely absorbed by the scene unfolding before them. The focus shifted as she spoke. It became about more than personal attacks. It became a discussion about creation versus commentary, about risks versus complacency, about action versus observation. "There's a difference," she stated flatly, "between creating something and standing on the sidelines picking apart what everyone else creates." Her words seemed to echo throughout the studio. What most didn't know was that it no longer felt like an argument between two people. It felt like a clash of two ideologies. The silence after her words was deafening. Every eye in the studio was fixed on her and the host. The tension had reached an unbearable peak, and any movement felt magnified. One of the hosts subtly adjusted in her chair. The other looked towards the control booth. No one seemed sure where this was going, but it was clear this conversation had taken on a life of its own. She continued, growing in confidence with every second. "When people connect to my work, it's not with my perfection they connect with. They connect with the struggle, and they connect with the fact that you can do something with your life even when nobody expected it from you." Her voice resonated clearly in the space, a bold defense of not just herself, but of aspiration. For a moment, the host struggled for a response, his earlier calm composure failing him. The audience could tell thousands of thoughts seemed to hover in the air all at once. No one seemed to be thinking of ratings, of publicity, or promotion. They only cared about who would crack first. Then another attempt to steer things back onto track was made. It was her show, her stage, her space after all. But the response was immediate. The actress simply laughed and shook her head slowly. That's the difference, she replied. This was never about ownership. It was about opportunity. The words were simple, but they held a profound weight, and the room fell into silence once again. She stood tall, scanning the room before looking back at the host. The thing I'm most disappointed in is that this didn't have to be what we are talking about right now. Her voice lowered a bit, making it that much more impactful. We could have talked about growth. We could have talked about resilience and lessons learned from failing. We could have had a conversation that gives people something worthwhile they take with them. The audience hung on her every word. We could have talked about creation, about perseverance, about leadership, and how to push forward despite the odds. We could have explored ideas that encourage people to reach for their dreams and to build something lasting for themselves. She paused, and the words seemed to settle in the air. We had a chance to talk about all of that, and this is what it has become. That last statement hung like a final chord. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, and if their faces were any indication, everyone in the studio understood exactly the same thing. This had become something much bigger than anyone had predicted, and for the first time during the interview it felt like the main event hadn't even started yet. The studio room was totally turned around. What started out as an awkward discussion transformed into a moment that no one seemed able to look away from. The actress stood her ground, never once faltering in her presence, whereas the interviewer seemed increasingly unnerved by the direction the conversation took. Each individual in the room knew the conversation was rapidly coming to a head. It was an attempt again to salvage the discussion that had quickly slipped out of the interviewer's hands, that one of the hosts finally cut her off. A commercial break was in order. The conversation had certainly gone off the rails of an average television talk show interview. Both parties were looking for the final word, and the air was too thick to bear. It was at this point that something changed. Underneath all the anger, for the first time, a sense of disappointment was found in her tone. And unfortunately, she started. None of this needed to happen. This was a chance for a real discussion to happen here. Silence filled the room as she continued. It was a chance to discuss the struggles, the growth, the lessons, and the reality of working your way up in a very judgmental public world. Instead, it became about breaking down, not understanding. The words resonated differently than the sharper, quicker statements that preceded them. They weren't words fueled by anger, but a criticism of the situation at hand. The studio room listened closely as she elaborated on how easy it is to point fingers from the sideline, and how much more difficult it is to create something and put it out for people to judge. There was a moment of dead silence across the studio before a single person reacted. The cameras stayed glued on the table. The crew members stayed glued to their spots. Even the hosts looked lost. This was no longer a segment for television. This felt like the climactic point in a storyline years in the making. She began to pack up her things to leave. Every movement was calculated, every step was precise. Nothing seemed remotely chaotic. She looked back toward the table and acknowledged them before leaving. No matter what had happened, she remained professional. And then she turned toward the camera. What she said was the next event that had everyone's attention immediately captured. Her tone shifted from the harsh, authoritative sound to one that was more personal. To everybody out there, she said, do not let anyone tell you you're not worth it. There's always going to be someone saying something negative about your goals, your dreams, or your passions. All you have to do is pick whose voice is worth listening to. Continue to build, continue to grow, continue to believe. Those were words that resonated in every single ear in the studio room. And for the first time that entire afternoon, the tense atmosphere became just a little bit less strained. The argument was no longer about winning or losing, but about self-confidence and resilience in the face of criticism. She stood up without another word and headed for the door. The click of her heels on the studio floor seemed loud enough for the entire set to hear as her every eye followed her away from the table, where, stunned and silent, the remaining hosts looked at one another. The cameras still rolled, and you could see on each of their faces that this was beyond just a television segment. Shock, reflection, disbelief. These are reactions that typically come when something extraordinary takes place that was supposed to be a normal day at the office. And just like that, it was over. But the discussion was just beginning. Almost instantly after she had left, the fans were on each side of the argument. Some felt like she was justified in her defense, others thought she went way too far. Social media was instantly buzzing with the clips of the interview, and millions of viewers were debating what had just happened. Regardless of everyone's thoughts, it was what was being said about it that truly mattered. This is what makes moments like these so interesting. The debate itself never seems to be about what it's about. It's always about bigger things, such as responding to a stressful situation and the strength of two opposing personalities refusing to bend.